I want to tell you about my work at Gallaudet College. I decided to take a sabbatical leave from Gallaudet College to write something about a deaf person. I've always wanted to write something about a deaf person, and I finally decided to write about Laurent Clerc. His sign is this. So I left Gallaudet College for 1/2 a year, and I went to several different libraries researching in Washington, D.C., Gallaudet, the Library of Congress, and in Hartford, Connecticut. I went to 8 different libraries in Hartford, and I researched and gathered material, information on Clerc from the time he was growing up in 1785 to his death in 1869. Finally, I decided to write a play to be presented at Gallaudet College. When I wrote the play, the problem was that I limited the play to only 3 years of Clerc's life. That's all the play is about, 1866 to 1869. Now I would like to tell you about the rest of his life from the time he was growing up. June 28, 1864, it was a big day for deaf people. In a church in Washington, D.C., many people gathered. What was the big event? It was really the birth of Gallaudet College. The president of Gallaudet College was only 29 years old. His name was Edward Minor Gallaudet. He stood up, saw all the people gathered in front of him, and gave his opening inaugural speech. The government officials were all seated on the platform, congressmen, ministers, and also deaf children from Kendall School also came to watch this great celebration. Gallaudet's son, named Edward Minor Gallaudet, gave his talk, and he noticed his grandmother sitting there, Sophia Fowler Gallaudet. She was 66 years old. Next to her was his oldest brother, who was 42 years old, Thomas Gallaudet, son of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who founded the first school in America. Now his young son was here establishing Gallaudet College. And then there was a deaf man also sitting there, an artist. His name was John Callan. He was there to receive an honorary degree. There were also several other famous speakers who came up one by one and gave long speeches. One after another gave a long address until finally Edward Minor Gallaudet introduced an old man who was 79 years old, a little trembling and weak. And he spelled his name Laurent Clerc. Clerc got up, walked to the podium, faced all of the people. All were hearing, and they applauded. And the deaf people waved their handkerchiefs, as was their custom. Clerc stood before them, looked out and began his talk. He said, "It's really a great honor to be here at the opening of Gallaudet College." It was really, he spoke very briefly. Then he turned and looked at Edward Minor Gallaudet, so young, sitting next to him. And he looked at his older brother. And he looked at the grandmother, Sophia Fowler Gallaudet, all very old. His mind was still very clear and straight. And he began to think back many, many years before. In France, the time of an autocratic government in France, during the reign of Louis XVI, who married Queen Marie Antoinette, was the time of the French Revolution. Also was near the time of Bastille Day, and it was the time of the terrible Reign of Terror, during which many people in France were beheaded. Blood flowed all over the country of France when King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette were also beheaded. It was at that time that Clerc was born in 1785. During these terrible times, Clerc was born, and at age 2, he was sitting on a high chair. Somehow, an accident happened, and the high chair fell over, and Clerc the infant fell out of the high chair near the hearth of the fireplace and was hit in the back on the side of his head. And we signed the sign Clerc the way we do because of 2 scars on the side of his head. When he fell and hit his head, he became deaf and he lost his sense of smell. Now, all along, Clerc used to play with the children in the neighborhood, but then when they went to school, he was left alone. And so he played outside in the woods, near the streams, near the rolling hills, until he was 12 years old. And his uncle stopped by to visit the family, and he saw that Clerc was already 12 years old and had not yet been to school. He had no formal education. So he persuaded Clerc's parents to send him to Paris, where they had a school for the deaf. So the mother and father hated to lose their son far away from home, and yet they permitted his uncle to take him in a stagecoach from La Belle in the south of France to Paris. This is the sign for Paris. When Clerc arrived and his uncle dropped him off at the school, the superintendent of the school was not there. The superintendent's name was Abbé de Sicard. But Clerc met a deaf teacher named Jean Massieu. If you're wondering why the superintendent wasn't there, it was at that time that Abbé Sicard was arrested and put into jail, and he was waiting to be beheaded. While Clerc was staying in the school, Jean Massieu was so worried about the superintendent. He loved the abbé so much. He decided to call the deaf people of Paris together and try to decide what they can do, how they could get the abbé released. So they decided to send a petition and bring it to the French Assembly. And in front of all the hearing people seated around, Jean Massieu read the letter from the deaf people, pleading that the abbé be released. After several days of consideration, the assembly decided to free Abbé Sicard and return him to the Institute. Suppose Sicard had not been released, that he had stayed in jail and been beheaded. Would I be here today telling you this story about Clerc? I wonder. Now, let me remember. Ah yes, when Sicard and Clerc, who was young, first met, they looked at each other. They met in the school at that time. I would like to show you a picture of that school. Maybe at that time it was new, but it's really very old. Here's the picture of the school. Last summer, my wife and I went to Europe, and we visited many foreign countries. And yes, we stopped in Paris and visited the Paris Institute for the Deaf. We looked around at the buildings that are very, very old, almost worn out, but the school is still there. And we met some French deaf children and some older people too. It was really a nice experience for us to have. While Clerc was young, while he was growing up, he became Abbé Sicard's favorite pupil. The abbé taught him, and Massieu taught Clerc, and he became very brilliant, even though he hadn't had schooling until he was age 12. In spite of that, he became very brilliant. In fact, Sicard offered him a teaching position at the Institute in Paris, and he accepted. Now he was in his 20s. I want to show you a picture of Clerc as a young man in Paris. Maybe you'll notice that in the picture it shows that the front of his head is bald. I looked and looked at that picture after I found it. It was a very small photograph in the Library of Congress, and I had it blown up to a larger picture. And I looked and wondered, why is his hair like that? I've often seen other pictures of Clerc at a later age, and he has a full head of hair. But why, when he was young, was it bald in the front? Aha! While he was young was the time of Napoleon, the French emperor. And you've seen, and the young men in Paris at that time looked to Napoleon for fashion. And if you'll notice, pictures of Napoleon also show his high forehead and balding in the front. And so many of the men during that time shaved the front of their heads, just like women today often follow the fashions in style. Later on, of course, Clerc let his hair grow out. Clerc taught in the Paris school for many, many years, and people from many different countries would come and visit the school to see Massieu's class and Clerc's class and study how they were teaching deaf children. And their techniques began to spread to other countries. Even a man from Russia, from St. Petersburg, came to visit the school and see Clerc's work, and he was inspired. So he went and asked Clerc if he would be willing to come and teach in Russia. And Clerc accepted, and he was excited and anxious to go. After the Russian left, Clerc met Sicard and said that he wanted to go to Russia to teach. Sicard did not like the idea, but he said it was Claire's decision. So Clerc waited and waited until the man from Russia returned from his visit. He didn't come back, and finally he heard from the Russian saying that they didn't have enough money, and so they canceled the whole thing. Clerc was disappointed, but imagine if the man from Russia had found money and brought Clerc to St. Petersburg to teach there. Would I be here telling you this story about Clerc? And so, since the idea of teaching in Russia was canceled, Napoleon now had many, many enemies. One of his enemies happened to be Sicard. And Sicard was very afraid of Napoleon. And so he decided to go into exile, and he took Clerc and Massieu with him, and they escaped across the Channel to England, to London. This is the sign for London. Sicard, Massieu, and Clerc, what did they do in England? Well, that was simple. They continued their work, giving lectures and traveling all around to the English people. They would go to lecture halls where many of the important people would gather, and Sicard would stand while people asked questions. Sicard would interpret, and Massieu and Clerc would answer the questions by writing on a blackboard. The hearing people were shocked that deaf people could write. It's the same old story. One day, while they were still in exile, Clerc was standing in front of people, and suddenly the Duke of Kent and the Duchess of Wellington and the Duke of Orleans, three very important people, were there at the lecture. Remember, the Duchess of Wellington's husband had already gone to Waterloo. It was on that day, while the people were asking questions, and Sicard was interpreting and Clerc was answering, writing on the board most of the day, when suddenly the Prince Regent came rushing into the room and hollered that the war was over, that we have won at Waterloo, defeating Napoleon. Napoleon lost, the Duke of Wellington won, and his wife was sitting right there. Massieu and Clerc witnessed that historical event. Sicard finally made plans to leave London and go back home. But he had a few days left to give several more talks. As the time drew near for them to leave, it was the last day they were in England. The next day they would go home to France. While they were lecturing, way in the back of the crowd, there sat a short man who was from America, who was very impressed with the lecture and the questions and answers. And when the lecture was finished, that young man came up to the front and introduced himself to Sicard, Clerc, and Massieu. And he said, "My name is Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet from America." They shook hands. I want to show you a picture of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. This is his sign. Gallaudet looked at the three men, two deaf and one hearing. And Sicard invited Gallaudet to come to Paris and learn from our school. And Gallaudet explained that he wanted to establish a school for the deaf in America. So Sicard invited him to come to Paris, but they had to travel just a few. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet wanted to travel a few more days around England. Imagine, Gallaudet had appeared on the last day of their stay in London. Suppose Gallaudet had missed that last lecture. Would you be watching me today telling you the story of Laurent Clerc? Ah, yes, now I remember. While Gallaudet was traveling in England, he met many frustrations as he observed the various methods of teaching deaf children. Finally, he decided to go to Paris to learn the art of teaching. And he went and studied Massieu's class and Clerc's class for several months until his time was up. And the people in Hartford, in America, were saying to him, "Come home, you've stayed too long." So finally, Gallaudet asked Clerc, "I have to go back to America. Could you give me 2 deaf teachers from Paris who are skilled in both English and French?" And Clerc said, "Yes, I'll be happy to help you." And he found 2 deaf teachers. And he presented their names to Gallaudet. Gallaudet looked at the 2 names, and he changed his mind. He said, "I don't want them, I want you." Clerc said, "Me? Really? I don't know English." Gallaudet said, "You will learn English." And Clerc suddenly became excited about the idea of going to America. Gallaudet offered him to stay in America 3 years, a 3-year contract, and Clerc accepted. Of course, Sicard became very upset. He didn't want Clerc to go to America. The deaf children needed Clerc. Massieu didn't want him to go, thought it was a stupid idea. But Clerc was very stubborn and decided to go anyway. So he went and visited his family in the south of France. He went from Paris to La Belle, 350 miles, visited his mother. His father had died a while ago. His mother had already heard the news, and she also was upset. "Why are you going to America?" And Clerc said, I must help the deaf children in America. They have no teachers. They have no hearing or deaf teachers in America." His mother kept persuading him to stay, but Clerc remained stubborn. Finally, his family gave up, wished him goodbye. He stayed 2 weeks at home. Then he left La Belle, traveled by coach back to Paris. Arrived the next day, went to the office and signed his 3-year contract. Everything was ready, packed his suitcase, and went by stagecoach to Le Havre to board the ship. Clerc looked at the sea, out across into the unknown, mustered up his courage, and got on the ship. Now, traveling by ship from Paris to America at that time took 52 days. What did they do? Well, Gallaudet taught Clerc English, and Clerc, in exchange, taught Gallaudet Sign Language for 52 days. But maybe you think that the trip was very pleasant. Oh no. On the ship, they would encounter terrible storms every once in a while. People would get sick and throw up. They would have to stay in bed. And in the room where Clerc stayed, sometimes it would get very, very hot and he would sweat. The next day it would change and be very cold and he would have to pile on the blankets. He suffered very much. Sometimes the sea would be very calm and the ship would remain under the hot sun for several days. But Gallaudet continued teaching Clerc English, and Clerc continued teaching Gallaudet Sign Language until they arrived in New York after 52 days. When they arrived in New York, Clerc looked around. Don't think New York City was like it looks today. Clerc looked around and he didn't like the looks of the buildings compared with Paris, that was fancy and had museums and theaters. But America was very plain and humble. And Clerc himself became very upset and homesick, and he wanted to go back to Paris. Even after the long trip, he immediately became homesick for Paris. So they went by stagecoach to Hartford, Connecticut. When they arrived and saw the people dressed all the same, Clerc again became very upset. When they arrived at the Cogswell house, opened the doors, and Mrs. Cogswell announced the arrival of Clerc, she said to her family, "Go call Alice." And her young daughter went to call Alice while Mr. Gallaudet and Mr. Clerc were meeting Mrs. Cogswell, and Gallaudet was interpreting. Clerc was still very disgusted and kept on saying he wanted to go home. Inside, Gallaudet was heartbroken that Clerc did not like America. Finally, Alice Cogswell arrived and met Clerc, began to gesture and sign. And finally, Clerc was shocked. Alice already knew some sign language. Some were gestures, but some were signs, and she already knew them. And he wondered how. Ah, yes. When Gallaudet decided to go to Europe a long time before, he didn't want to leave Alice Cogswell to stay alone in the house. So he put her in a private school for girls, where he met a teacher named Lydia. And Lydia taught Alice and all the other hearing girls in the class to use signs to communicate with Alice. And those signs continued and developed into their own sign language. When Clerc saw this, he thought it was wonderful, thanks to Lydia Hanley. Alice had not yet really learned sign language. If Alice had not yet learned sign language, and if Clerc had followed his homesickness and left for Paris, would I be standing here today telling you this story? Alice and Clerc became very close, and Gallaudet established the school for the deaf, wanted to establish a school for the deaf. So he looked around for money for 1 year, and finally he established his school. Not really a school building, but just a school in a hotel. I would like to show you a picture of the hotel. Do you see that picture? While I was doing my research, I knew that in the American School for the Deaf, they had a picture of 3 of the buildings, but they had no picture of the original building. So I looked around, and by accident, I found a very tiny picture. And the name on it said City Hotel. I said, I've heard that name sometime before. And I found that that was the exact place where Gallaudet and Clerc had established the first school. I was so excited. I had the picture Xeroxed, brought it to a photographer and had it enlarged, and now you can see that building. Really, it's a very, very old picture. They took over the first, second, and third floor. The first floor was the classrooms, the second was sleeping quarters, and the third also sleeping rooms. When they opened the school, they had 7 pupils. 7. One of the 7 was Alice Cogswell. They stayed in that hotel for 1 year until they found another place, a big house. So they moved into that house, and that was the first school building. I'll show you a picture of that. This is the second school building. While Clerc was teaching the 7 deaf students, one of them, named Elizabeth, who was the oldest, and another girl, Sophia Fowler, maybe they were 17 or 18 or 19 years old. The others were about 14. 1 year, 2 years passed, and Clerc kept on teaching, but he kept noticing one pupil, Elizabeth, and he fell in love with her. He proposed marriage to her, of course, after she had finished school. Clerc married Elizabeth, who herself was deaf, and continued teaching. They had their first baby, and then Philadelphia needed some help. So Clerc decided to go to Philadelphia with his family. He went, helped them straighten out their school program, making changes. He taught there, and while they were in Philadelphia, he heard about the famous American painter living in Philadelphia. And he asked if the painter could paint a picture, a portrait of his family. He said yes, he would be happy to, and he painted 2 pictures. Today, if you see a painting by William Pyle, it costs a lot of money, and I'll show you these 2 pictures of Clerc and his wife. Can you see the sign E? That's for Elizabeth. Take another look at the picture. After 7 months in Philadelphia, Clerc moved back to Hartford to continue his family. He had 6 children. 2 died during birth. 4 were 2 girls and 2 boys. The oldest daughter became a teacher at the School for the Deaf. The second became a minister. The third daughter married the mayor of Hartford, and the fourth son, Clerc sent to study the silk business in France, and after several years he came back and established his own business in New York City. Gallaudet and Clerc worked together, and their friendship grew very strong. Whether it was teaching or gathering money or conducting experiments, they were conducting very strange experiments that I want to share with you. You know the hand alphabet, but Gallaudet was not satisfied with the ABCs. Signs were wonderful, but Gallaudet was still a strong oralist and was not happy with the finger spelling. So he tried to invent a new alphabet called the alphabet of sense. Puzzling, isn't it? So he set up a wall, and he had different jars. For instance, A would be ammonia. B would be bergamot. Smells almost like mint. C might be cinnamon. D, E, F, G, H, and so forth, different scents. On one side of the wall. On the other side, he had other jars. The students would take a stick, dip it in the jar, wave it on the top of the wall. The other students would smell the scent and knew which letter it was. For example, the students would smell H-E-L-L-O and communicate through smell. Can you imagine? Gallaudet thought it was just wonderful, but it seems it failed. Why? Clerc himself had lost his sense of smell. Gallaudet still wasn't satisfied, and he decided to try another experiment. And he invented the alphabet of faces, facial expressions. For A, awesome. B, boldness. C, curiosity. D, despair. E, eagerness. F, fear. G, gladness, and so on. Now remember, A, awesome. B, C, curious. D, despair. E, eagerness. F, fear. G, gladness. Now I want to show you facial finger spelling. Did you understand me? Try again. D, E, A, F. See? The finger spelling through the face. I want to tell you a short story about this facial expression finger spelling. Two deaf adults got into a stagecoach together, going from one town to another. They were sitting next to each other, and there were two other people sitting across from them. It's just like when you sit in the bus talking with your hands and other people kind of stare at you. But this was a long time ago, in the 1820s or 30s. The two deaf were sitting, not signing, so they were talking with their face in facial expressions. And they kept on, all the way from one town to another. The people in the seat across them were trying to figure out what they were doing. And Gallaudet and Clerc also tried to find out the best methods, continued trying to work together. After only 13 years in the school, Gallaudet decided to resign, but Clerc decided to stay in America. He did go back to visit his family in France, but he ended up staying in the United States for 42 years. Including his 8 years of teaching in Paris, he had taught deaf children for 50 years. Here's a picture of Clerc during his old age. Now, from the time of his birth in 1785 to that inauguration of Gallaudet College, it's the same time as from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln. Clerc stayed in America. He didn't go to any more schools. He never went to college. He had no time for himself. He devoted his full attention to helping deaf children. But 3 different colleges presented him with honorary degrees. From that time all the way to the present, there is Clerc standing before all the people, looking at Edward Minor Gallaudet, his mother, thinking of how wonderful it was, this opening of Gallaudet. Couldn't imagine that he would be standing here today. And he began his speech. He thanked all of the people, thanked everyone for inviting him to see this most important day. The people began to applaud, and the deaf people waved their handkerchiefs again. Clerc looked around, and in his mind said to himself, I wish I could have gone to college. Even though he stayed in America for many years, he remained a Frenchman at heart. The deaf people, after all these years, called him the father of the American instructors of the deaf. Wow, a Frenchman, but people call me an American. Clerc passed away in 1889, and people contributed money for a bust of him, a monument. I'll show you a picture of that monument. Now, you see that statue? Do you see the engraving? It says, the Apostle of the Deaf Mutes of the New World. That's the inscription on the monument. I have seen that quote before. While I was doing my research, I found a letter written by Sicard, sent to Clerc just before Clerc left for America a long time before. And in his letter he says, you are the apostle of the deaf mutes of the New World. And I must tell you that Clerc really is the greatest deaf teacher of all time.